The letter sat folded in Captain Owen Mercer's breast pocket, unopened for 3 days. He could feel its weight every time he moved, a physical reminder of the choice he'd already made before reading it. His wife had written it during his last leave, handed it to him at the airport with red eyes and steady hands. He'd promised to read it once he was settled. That was 4 months ago. Now, standing in the operations tent of Forward Operating Base Kestrel, watching his battalion prepare for what intelligence called a routine stabilization mission, he understood why he'd never broken the seal. Some truths change you before you're ready to be changed. Lieutenant Colonel Vance stood at the map table, his finger tracing a valley route that looked clean on paper. Mercer had served under Vance for 18 months, long enough to recognize the slight tremor in his commander's hand when he pointed at terrain features. Not fear. Vance had walked through worse, but something closer to recognition. The kind a surgeon might feel before making an incision he knows will reveal more damage than the scan suggested. "The village sits here," Vance said, tapping a contour cluster. "Local council requested our presence. Bandits, they claim, terrorizing supply routes." He paused, and in that silence, Mercer heard what wasn't being said. Villages didn't request military presence. They tolerated it or they fled from it. Requests came through interpreters who worked for whoever paid them last. Staff Sergeant Chen stood near the tent entrance, methodically checking her rifle for the 4th time in an hour. Mercer had noticed that about her over the past 6 months. The repeated checks, the way she positioned herself near exits, the coffee she poured but rarely drank. She'd been a logistics coordinator before her convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar. She'd requested infantry reassignment within a week of recovering. Some people ran from trauma. Others ran toward the only thing that made sense of it. "Captain Mercer will lead the advance element," Vance continued. 2 platoons. Establish rapport. Assess actual threat level. Report back within 72 hours. Simple presence operation. Simple. Mercer had learned to distrust that word the way sailors distrust calm seas. Simple meant someone higher up the chain had stopped asking difficult questions. Simple meant assumptions were calcifying into orders. "Sir," Mercer said, "the last patrol through that sector reported unusual radio interference. Possible electronic countermeasures." "Noted in the brief," Vance replied. His eyes met Mercer's for just a moment, a flicker of acknowledgement that neither of them believed this would be simple, but both would perform their roles anyway. That was the machinery of command. You voiced concerns for the record, received acknowledgement for the record, then executed orders because the machinery required motion. Specialist Kovich approached with the communications manifest. 23 years old, linguistics degree from a state school he couldn't afford, enlisted because teaching jobs had dried up and his mother needed surgery. He'd told Mercer this during a night watch, unprompted, the way young soldiers sometimes confessed their civilian lives when darkness made officers feel like priests. "Sir, satellite window is optimal from 0600 to 1400 hours. After that, we're on line of sight relay only." "Understood." Mercer took the manifest, noting the gap. 6 hours of reliable communication in terrain that could turn hostile in 6 minutes. He signed the document because that's what captains did. They accepted responsibility for variables they couldn't control. The briefing dissolved into preparation. Soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, the kind born from repetition rather than enthusiasm. First Sergeant Rourke, a 20-year veteran with a daughter graduating high school next month, oversaw equipment distribution. Private Maida, barely 19, triple-checked his aid bag with the intensity of someone who'd already seen what happens when supplies run short. Corporal Diaz, quietest man in the company, cleaned his weapon with almost religious focus, each motion deliberate, as if the rifle were a rosary and maintenance a prayer. Mercer walked through the staging area, not inspecting. Rourke handled that, but observing. Leadership, he'd learned, was mostly watching. Watching for the lieutenant who moved too confidently. Watching for the private who'd stopped joking. Watching for signs that the weight was distributed unevenly, that someone was carrying too much or pretending to carry nothing. Lieutenant Park met him near the vehicle bay. Youngest officer in the battalion, engineering degree, officer candidate school graduate with honors, and absolutely terrified in a way he thought he was hiding. Mercer recognized it because he'd worn the same mask 15 years ago. "Captain, I've reviewed the route. Multiple choke points. If we encounter resistance, we'll adapt." Mercer kept his voice level. "You've run through the contingencies?" "7 times, sir." "Then you're prepared." This was the lie officers told junior officers, that preparation equaled control. The truth was messier. Preparation meant you'd thought about what could go wrong, not that you could prevent it. But young lieutenants needed to believe in something, and doubt wasn't issued with their commission. Night settled over the base with the weight of inevitability. Mercer sat alone in his quarters, a 12-by-8 space that smelled of dust and diesel. The letter remained in his pocket. He'd written a response weeks ago, sealed it, addressed it, but he hadn't sent it, couldn't send it, because his response required honesty, and honesty required words he didn't have yet. The truth was simple and impossible. He no longer knew if he was staying in the military because it gave his life purpose or because civilian life had stopped making sense. His wife had asked which mattered more, the marriage or the mission. He'd said the marriage immediately without thinking, but she'd seen through that. Of course he'd say that. The question wasn't what he'd say. The question was what he'd choose when the next deployment order arrived. At 0430 hours, the company assembled in darkness. No speeches, no rallying cries. Just soldiers loading into vehicles with the mechanical precision of people performing a ritual they'd performed too many times. Mercer moved among them. A word here, a nod there. Presence without pressure. Chen approached as he reached his vehicle. "Sir, night vision inventories are short 3 units. Equipment malfunction logged. Can we compensate? We'll pair up. Slower movement, but manageable." Manageable. Another word that meant acceptable risk. Do it. The convoy rolled out at 0500, headlights cutting through pre-dawn darkness. 6 vehicles, 43 soldiers, enough ammunition for a sustained firefight they weren't expecting, and insufficient supplies for an extended isolation they hadn't planned for. The machinery of warfare, Mercer thought, grinding forward on assumptions. The valley road unwound like a promise that would be broken slowly. At first, terrain matched the maps. Narrow passes, terraced hillsides, villages perched on slopes like barnacles on a hull. Locals watched the convoy pass with expressions that revealed nothing. Not hostile, not welcoming. Just watching the way people watch weather systems they can't control. By 0730 they'd reached the first waypoint. Kovich attempted satellite contact. Static answered. "Try again," Mercer said. More static. Textured differently but equally meaningless. "Could be atmospheric," Kovich offered, but his voice carried no conviction. "Or jamming," Chen said quietly. Mercer studied the hills. No movement, no obvious threat, just rock and scrub and sky. "Continue to primary objective. We'll establish comms from elevated position." The convoy resumed. Mercer felt the shift in his soldiers, the tightening of awareness, the way hands rested closer to weapons. This was the space between peace and violence, where professionalism was measured by how well you controlled the fear you were absolutely experiencing. The village appeared at 9:15, smaller than intelligence suggested. 30 structures, maybe 40. Mud brick and corrugated metal. Practical architecture for people who prioritize survival over aesthetics. No obvious military presence. No barricades. But also, and this registered immediately, no people. Mercer raised his fist. The convoy halted. "Lieutenant Park, dismount team. Standard spacing. Chen, establish perimeter. Kovich, keep trying comms." Soldiers flowed from vehicles with practiced caution, weapons ready but not raised. A posture that said prepared without saying aggressive. Mercer moved forward with Park and 4 others approaching the village center. The silence felt wrong, not peaceful, absent, as if sound itself had been evacuated. Buildings stood open. Cook fires were cold but recently used. Personal items remained. Blankets, cooking pots, children's toys. People had left, but not in panic. This was organized departure. "Sir." Diaz stood near a well, pointing downward. Mercer approached, looked into darkness. 20 feet down, water glinted. And floating in it, face up, a body in civilian clothes. Park turned away, composing himself. Chen radioed the discovery. Rourke approached, looked once, and said nothing. What was there to say? A dead civilian in a well-meant contamination, investigation, delays, questions that had no good answers. Meta, document it. Don't disturb the scene. Mercer's voice remained steady through habit, not calm. Continue sweep. They found 2 more bodies in a storage cellar. Older men, hands bound, single gunshot wounds to the head. Execution style. Professional. The kind of killing that followed judgment, not rage. Park's radio crackled. Sir, we found something. Northeast corner. Mercer reached the location to find Chen standing before a wall. Someone had painted a message in crude letters. Soldiers bring death. We chose life. Who wrote this? Park asked, as if that mattered. Someone who wanted us to understand why they left, Mercer said. Or someone who wanted us to think that's why they left. Those bodies weren't killed by villagers running away, Chen said. No. Mercer studied the message, the bodies, the empty village. They weren't. Kovich jogged up, breathing hard. Sir, still no satellite contact. Tried all frequencies. The pieces assembled themselves in Mercer's mind with the clarity of truth he didn't want to accept. An empty village. Executed civilians. Communications failure. A routine mission to terrain someone had carefully prepared. We're not here to help locals, Mercer said quietly. We're here because someone wanted us here. An ambush? Park's voice climbed slightly. Or observation or misdirection. Mercer looked at the surrounding hills, feeling exposed in a way the tactical situation didn't fully explain. Pack it up. We're leaving. Sir, we haven't completed the assessment. The assessment is complete. This village was a message, and I'm not staying to debate its meaning. They were halfway to the vehicles when the first shot arrived. Not the crack of nearby fire, but the distant thump of something launching. Mercer's brain processed it before conscious thought could catch up. Mortar. Incoming. Soldiers scattered as training overrode fear. The round impacted 30 meters away, not on target, but close enough to spray shrapnel through the air. Mercer felt something tug his sleeve, fragments passing millimeters from flesh. 2 more rounds followed in quick succession. Whoever was firing had range but not precision. Or they had precision, and were choosing to miss. Warning shots. To the vehicles. Chen, cover fire. Suppressive, not targeted. The team sprinted, discipline holding chaos at bay by the thinnest margin. Vehicles roared to life. Soldiers piled in, return fire crackling toward hills they couldn't see enemies in. The convoy lurched forward, away from the village. More mortar rounds fell behind them, closer to accuracy now. One struck 20 meters from the rear vehicle, lifting it partially off the ground before it crashed back down, still mobile but damaged. Casualties? Mercer shouted into the radio. Negative, all mobile. Chen's voice came back tight with controlled adrenaline. They drove hard for 20 minutes, putting distance between themselves and the kill zone that hadn't quite killed them. Finally, Mercer called a halt in a defensible depression between hills. Soldiers dismounted, established security, treated minor wounds. Rourke moved among them with the calm of a man who'd done this before, checking bodies and spirits with equal attention. Mercer pulled his officers together. Assessment. Rear vehicle suspension is compromised, Chen reported. 60% mobility, maybe less if terrain gets rough. 1 soldier with shrapnel in the leg, superficial, Maida added. 2 others with minor cuts. All combat effective. Communication still down, Kovich said. It's not equipment failure, sir. Something's blocking signal. Park looked at Mercer with the expression of someone whose 7 contingency plans had just become irrelevant. What do we do? What do we do? The question every lieutenant eventually asked, and every captain eventually learned to answer with confidence they didn't feel. We complete the mission, Mercer said. New priority. Establish contact with base, report compromise, await extraction or new orders. The high ground. Chen pointed to a ridge 3 kilometers northeast. Line of sight to Fob Kestrel from there. 8 hours on foot, maybe less. With a damaged vehicle? We leave it. Redistribute personnel. Mercer studied the ridge, the route, the variables multiplying faster than solutions. Rourke, how much water? 2 days at combat ration levels. Ammunition? Sufficient for sustained contact, insufficient for prolonged engagement. Everything was sufficient, insufficient, enough until it wasn't. Mercer looked at his soldiers. 43 people whose safety was his abstract responsibility and concrete burden. Mount up. We head for the ridge. They moved as quickly as compromised mobility allowed, abandoning the damaged vehicle after stripping it of supplies. The column spread thinner, more vulnerable. Mercer positioned himself mid-convoy, where he could respond to front or rear threats. Chen took point with the best remaining vehicle. Rourke held the rear. Hours passed. The landscape refused to change. Same rocks, same slopes, same hostile neutrality. Soldiers began to show fatigue not from exertion, but from sustained tension. There's a limit to how long humans can maintain alertness without contact. The body demands either resolution or rest. At 1640 hours, they reached the ridge base. Steep but climbable. Vehicles couldn't make it, but people could. Chen, establish security down here. Park, you're with me. We take a comms team up, establish contact, guide the extraction. Park nodded, relief visible despite his best efforts to hide it. The promise of extraction, even hypothetical, was oxygen to suffocating morale. Mercer selected 6 soldiers for the climb, including Kovich and his radio equipment. They began ascending as daylight started its slow retreat. The climb was harder than it looked. Loose rock, steep grades, altitude that made breathing work. But by 1830, they crested the ridge and stopped. Below them, stretching across the valley floor like a geometric rash, lay an encampment. Not bandits, not irregulars. This was organized. Fortified positions, vehicle parks, command structures. Hundreds of people moving with military precision. Jesus, Park whispered. Kovic was already working the radio, hands moving with desperate efficiency. Fob Kestrel, this is Captain Mercer's element. Do you copy? Over. Static. Fob Kestrel, this is... A voice cut through, clear and close. Captain Mercer, I would appreciate if you lowered your radio's output. We've been listening. Mercer spun. 20 meters downslope, a man stood with a squad of armed soldiers, weapons trained with professional courtesy on Mercer's team. The man wore no uniform, just practical field clothing. His English carried an accent Mercer couldn't place. Educated, deliberate. You're surrounded, the man continued, walking closer with empty hands visible. Your unit below is similarly contained. No one needs to die today, but that outcome requires cooperation. Park's hand moved toward his sidearm. Mercer caught his wrist, shook his head slightly. The tactical equation was simple. 6 soldiers, surrounded on terrain that offered no cover, against a force with numerical and positional advantage. Who are you? Mercer asked. Names seem less important than intentions, don't you think? The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You came to this valley believing you were helping. You weren't. You came believing you understood the situation. You didn't. But you're intelligent enough to recognize when circumstances have changed. What do you want? Your vehicles, your weapons, your departure, in that order. He gestured to the encampment below. We have 200 fighters. You have 43 soldiers, limited supplies, and no reinforcements coming. Because your base doesn't know you're in trouble, and won't know until they expect your scheduled check-in 12 hours from now. The mathematics of surrender arranged themselves in Mercer's mind with brutal clarity. Fight. Lose, run, die, comply, survive with shame. If we surrender our weapons, what guarantee do we have? My word. The man's expression shifted, becoming something that might have been sympathy. I understand that means nothing to you, so consider this instead. Dead American soldiers create problems I don't need. Alive, defeated American soldiers create questions your military will want answered quietly. Your lives have more value to me than your deaths. Park was trembling now, the kind that came from rage meeting powerlessness. Mercer kept his voice level. I need to speak with my command. Speak with your conscience instead. That's who'll remember this longer. Mercer looked at his 6 soldiers. Kovich, white-faced but steady. Diaz, expressionless. 4 others whose names he knew, whose lives he was responsible for, whose trust he was about to violate. Lower weapons, Mercer said quietly. Sir? Park started. Lower. Weapons. They complied slowly, each movement a small betrayal of everything they'd been trained to believe. The enemy soldiers moved forward, collecting weapons with practiced efficiency. No gloating, no theatrics, just professionals completing a task. Your unit below will be processed similarly, the man said. Orderly, respectful. By dawn, you'll be released at the valley entrance with enough water to reach friendly territory. Your weapons and vehicles will remain with us. Why the village? Mercer asked. Why the bodies? Context, motivation, justification for your presence here. The man's expression hardened slightly. Wars aren't fought with bullets alone, Captain. They're fought with narratives. Today your narrative changes. You came to help. You were defeated. You survived. What story will you tell when you return? It was a genuine question, Mercer realized. This man understood that capture without death created complexity that military bureaucracies struggled to process. How do you court-martial an officer for choosing his soldiers' lives over his mission? How do you admit that an entire company surrendered without a fight? They were escorted down the ridge to where Chen and the others waited, already disarmed, sitting in controlled groups under guard. Chen's expression when she saw Mercer was worse than judgment. It was understanding. She knew exactly what equation he'd solved and what solving it had cost. The night that followed was longest of Mercer's life. Not because of how they were treated. The captors were professional, providing water and basic shelter, but because of the silence among his soldiers. No accusations, no anger, just silence, the kind that acknowledges something broken that can't be repaired. Rourke sat beside Mercer around 200 hours when darkness made conversation feel possible. You made the right call, sir. Did I? We're alive. That's not nothing. It's also not enough. Rourke was quiet for a moment. My daughter graduates next month. I'll be there because of what you decided today. That's enough for me. But it wasn't enough for Mercer, because survival without honor was a different kind of death, one that happened slowly, in the silence between what you were and what you became. At dawn, as promised, they were released. The enemy commander approached Mercer one final time. Your military will want to know what happened. Tell them the truth. Tell them you were outmatched, outmaneuvered, and made a choice. Some will understand. Others won't. That's the nature of command. You bear consequences others don't have to comprehend. The march back took 18 hours. No one spoke. Soldiers walked with the mechanical endurance of people whose bodies continued functioning while their spirits processed trauma. They reached Fob Kestrel at 1340 the following day, a company that had left with equipment and returned with nothing but the weight of what they'd carried back. Lieutenant Colonel Vance met them at the gate. His expression cycled through relief, confusion, and something darker as he absorbed the scene. 43 soldiers, 0 casualties, 0 equipment. Captain Mercer, my office. Now. The debrief lasted 4 hours. Mercer reported facts. The village, the bodies, the ambush, the choice. Vance listened without interruption, his face carefully neutral. When Mercer finished, Vance leaned back. You surrendered without a fight. I surrendered to avoid a fight I couldn't win. That's not your decision to make. It absolutely is, sir. I command those soldiers. Their lives are my responsibility. And the mission became impossible the moment we were compromised. Vance rubbed his face, looking older than he had 2 days ago. You understand what happens now. Investigation, review board, possible charges. I understand. Do you? Vance's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his professional veneer. Do you understand that this will define you? That every decision you made as a soldier will be re-examined through the lens of that surrender? Mercer thought of the letter in his pocket, still unread. Yes, sir. I understand. The investigation began within hours. Officers from battalion headquarters arrived, conducting interviews with clinical efficiency. Each soldier was questioned separately. What happened? Why? Could it have been prevented? The answers formed a coherent narrative that satisfied no one. Yes, Mercer had made a tactical decision. Yes, casualties would have been probable in resistance. No, resistance wasn't attempted. The machinery of military justice ground forward, transforming a complex human choice into a simple question. Did he fail his duty? Mercer was placed on administrative hold, relieved of command pending review. He watched his former company from a distance, saw how they moved differently now, more cautious, less confident. Chen avoided his eyes. Park threw himself into work with the desperation of someone trying to prove something. Rourke nodded when they passed, a small gesture that meant more than words. The letter remained unread. Mercer realized he'd been treating it like Schrödinger's cat. Until he opened it, his marriage existed in a quantum state of both intact and destroyed. The cowardice of that analogy wasn't lost on him. On the 5th day after their return, he finally broke the seal. The letter was short. His wife's handwriting was careful, each word chosen with the precision of someone trying not to cause unnecessary pain. I don't hate the military. I don't hate your service. But I can't compete with something that will always matter more. You say I come first, but you live for what comes next. I need a husband who's present, not someone whose mind is always deployed even when his body is home. I filed papers. They'll arrive after you read this. I'm sorry, but I'm also done being sorry. Mercer read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back in his pocket. The marriage was over. He'd known that intellectually, but confirmation carried its own specific gravity. Another thing surrendered, though this time through accumulation rather than decisive moment. That evening, Rourke found him on the base perimeter, staring at nothing. "Bad news, sir?" "The kind you already knew was coming." Rourke didn't ask for details. "For what it's worth, most of the company thinks you made the right call. Some are angry, sure, but most get it." "And the military?" "The military has never been great at understanding nuance." Rourke pulled out a cigarette, offered one to Mercer, who declined. "You know what's fucked up? If you'd gotten us all killed, you'd probably be recommended for a medal. Fought heroically against overwhelming odds. But you kept us alive, so now you're facing a board." "There's logic in that," Mercer said. "Dead soldiers can't contradict the official narrative." "Cynical, sir." "Earned, First Sergeant." They stood in silence, watching the sun set over terrain that looked peaceful until you remembered what lived in that peace. Ambush, compromise, the space between intention and outcome. The preliminary hearing occurred 3 weeks later. Mercer sat in a room designed to be intimidating through its absolute lack of distinguishing features. 3 officers faced him across a table, a colonel, a major, and a captain who looked younger than Park. The colonel opened. "Captain Mercer, you're not being charged at this time. This is an administrative review to determine if formal proceedings are warranted." "Understood, sir." "In your professional opinion, was combat avoidable?" "No, sir. Combat was certain if we resisted. And victory was impossible?" "Victory, sir, or survival." The major leaned forward. "Explain the distinction." "We could have fought. We would have lost. Some might call that noble, I call it wasteful. The Army values courage, Captain. The Army should value judgment, Major. Courage without wisdom is just expensive suicide." The young captain spoke for the first time. "You don't believe resistance would have changed the outcome?" "I believe resistance would have changed the body count, sir, not the result." They questioned him for 2 hours, probing the decision from every angle. Could he have withdrawn earlier? Could he have called for support? Could he have fortified and held position? Each question carried the implicit accusation that he'd failed to consider alternatives. Finally, the colonel said, "Captain, off the record, do you regret your decision?" Mercer thought about that, about his soldiers alive, about his career destroyed, about the cost of leadership when leadership meant choosing the least terrible option. "No, sir. I regret the situation that forced the decision. But the decision itself, I'd make it again." The hearing concluded with bureaucratic courtesy. They'd review his testimony, compare it to other accounts, and render judgment. Timeline, indefinite. Status, uncertain. Career, in suspension. Mercer returned to his quarters and did something he should have done weeks earlier. He wrote a letter to his ex-wife, not to convince her, not to argue, just to acknowledge, to say he understood, to admit that she'd been right about what mattered more, to apologize for pretending he could be 2 people simultaneously. He mailed it that evening. It wouldn't change anything, but it closed a loop he'd left open too long. The weeks that followed had a strange quality, simultaneously rushed and stagnant. Mercer was assigned administrative duties, paperwork that kept him busy without giving him purpose. He saw his former soldiers around the base. Some nodded, others looked away. All of them were processing their own versions of what happened, their own equations of honor and survival. Chen approached him one afternoon in the mess hall, sat down without asking. "Sir, I need to tell you something." "Go ahead, Staff Sergeant." "I've been thinking about that valley, about what you decided." She paused, searching for words. "My convoy, the IED. After that, I requested infantry because I needed to feel in control. Like if I was armed, prepared, trained, nothing could catch me off guard again." She looked directly at him. "But control is an illusion. You knew that. You knew we were never in control, just pretending we were. And when the pretense ended, you chose reality over pride. Some would call that cowardice. Some would be wrong, sir, respectfully. Chen, I appreciate—" "I'm not finished." Her voice held an edge he hadn't heard before. "We're trained to believe that surrender is the worst outcome. But you know what's worse? Dead soldiers, families destroyed, lives ended because someone prioritized mission over humanity." She stood. "I'm testifying on your behalf. Whatever they ask, I'm telling them you saved our lives. And if they punish you for that, then the military is more broken than I thought." She left before he could respond. But others followed. Diaz, quiet as ever, left a note in his mailbox. "Right call, sir." Maida stopped him during a morning run. "My mom thanks you for getting me home." "I do too." Even Park, who'd been most visibly shaken, approached with halting sincerity. "I was wrong to question you, sir. I was scared and I wanted someone to blame. But you were right. Rourke found him that evening. Half the company has submitted statements supporting you. Probably more coming. Whatever happens with the board, your soldiers know what you did." But it was Kovich who articulated what Mercer hadn't wanted to confront. The young specialist knocked on his door late one night, looking exhausted. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think they would have killed us if we'd fought?" The honest answer: "Yes. All of us? Not all, but enough." Mercer studied the young man's face. "Why?" "Because I keep thinking, if we'd fought, if some of us died, would the survivors feel better? Would honor make up for loss? And I can't balance that equation, sir. I'm glad I'm alive, but I'm also ashamed that I'm glad." His voice cracked slightly. "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. You're experiencing the guilt of survival without sacrifice. The military doesn't train us for that. It trains us to die honorably. Living honorably after dishonor? That's harder. So what do? We carry it. We accept that the choice was impossible, and we chose anyway. And we trust that time will provide perspective we don't have yet." Kovich nodded slowly, unconvinced but willing to accept the answer. After he left, Mercer sat alone, wondering if he believed his own advice. Time providing perspective? Maybe. Or maybe time just dulled the sharp edges until you couldn't remember what cut you. The formal hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the incident. Mercer prepared testimony, reviewed statements, and tried to anticipate questions. But beneath preparation was acceptance. His career was likely over. The question was whether it would end quietly or publicly. The night before the hearing, he received a visitor he hadn't expected. Lieutenant Colonel Vance. "May I come in, Captain?" Mercer gestured to the sparse room's single chair. Vance sat heavily, looking older under the fluorescent light. "I'm testifying tomorrow," Vance said. "Thought you should know what I'm saying." "Sir, you don't need to. I'm saying that I sent you on a mission with insufficient intelligence, inadequate support, and ambiguous objectives. I'm saying that you encountered a situation that exceeded the mission parameters. And I'm saying that your decision to prioritize personnel over equipment was consistent with your command discretion." Mercer absorbed this slowly. "Sir, that contradicts your initial assessment." "My initial assessment was anger speaking. I've had time to think." Vance rubbed his face. "I've been a soldier for 27 years, Mercer. In that time I've seen heroes and cowards, and I've learned that the difference between them is often just who survived to tell the story. What you did, that wasn't cowardice. That was the burden of command. Making the choice no one wants to make. Accepting the consequences no one wants to accept. The board may not see it that way." "The board," Vance said, voice carrying unexpected bitterness, "is composed of officers who've never faced that specific choice. They'll judge you from the safety of hypothetical scenarios. But I've been there. Different valley, different war, but same equation. And I made the other choice. Fought when wisdom said withdraw. Lost soldiers who deserved to live. Got a medal for valor." He looked at Mercer directly. "I'd trade that medal for the decision you made." Instantly. They sat in silence. Two officers separated by rank, but united by the understanding that command was fundamentally lonely. Not because you were isolated from others, but because certain decisions could only be made by one person, and that person had to live with them alone. "Thank you, sir," Mercer finally said. "Don't thank me. Just accept that whatever happens tomorrow, you were right. Sometimes being right costs everything. That doesn't make it wrong." The hearing convened at Euro 900 in a conference room that smelled of old coffee and older regrets. The board consisted of 5 officers ranging from major to full colonel. They reviewed Mercer's record, testimony, and supporting statements with the methodical efficiency of people following protocols that predated moral complexity. The questioning was thorough but not hostile. They asked about tactics, timelines, communication attempts. They asked about the enemy force composition, apparent training, organizational structure. They asked why he didn't attempt escape, why he didn't stall, why he didn't resist. To each question, Mercer provided the same fundamental answer. The lives of 43 soldiers had greater value than the objectives of one mission. The prosecution, though it wasn't technically a trial, pressed harder. "Captain, the code of conduct states that soldiers should never surrender of my own free will. You taught this to your soldiers, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you violated it. I interpreted it, sir. My will was to preserve my unit. Surrendering served that will. That's semantic gymnastics, Captain. No, sir, that's leadership. Doctrine provides guidance. Reality provides circumstances. Command is where those two meet. And you believe your interpretation supersedes established military guidelines? Mercer paused, knowing his answer would define how history remembered him. I believe, sir, that guidelines serve soldiers, not the other way around. If following doctrine kills people needlessly, the doctrine failed, not the officer who chose preservation. The room went silent. He'd essentially declared that he'd place his judgment above military law. It was career suicide, stated plainly. But the board colonel surprised him. Captain, that's either the most courageous or most arrogant thing I've heard in 30 years. I'm not sure which. Probably both, sir. Probably. The colonel looked at his colleagues, some silent communication passing between them. We'll adjourn to deliberate. You'll have our finding within 72 hours. The hearing concluded at 14:30 hours. Mercer walked out feeling strangely calm. The waiting was over. The decision was made. All that remained was learning how others judged what he'd already judged himself. Chen met him outside. How'd it go? Honestly, no idea. You look relieved. I am. The arguing is done. Now it's just consequences. Sir, can I buy you a coffee? Real coffee, not the motor oil the mess serves. They walked to a small cafe off base where soldiers pretended to be civilians for an hour. Chen ordered 2 dark roasts, and they sat by a window watching traffic pass with purposeless urgency. I've been thinking about staying in, Chen said after a long silence. Or getting out. Can't decide. What's stopping you? Same thing that stopped you from opening your wife's letter for 3 days. Fear that the answer changes everything. Mercer smiled slightly. You're perceptive. I've had time to observe, and I've learned something watching this whole mess unfold. What's that? That the military is simultaneously the best and worst thing that happened to me. It gave me purpose after the convoy. It gave me structure when I was falling apart, but it also demands I define myself by its standards, not mine, and I'm not sure I want that anymore. So what do you want? Chen looked out the window. To be okay with uncertainty. To make decisions that feel right even when they're hard. To stop needing someone else's approval for my own choices. She looked back at him. What you did taught me that. You chose what mattered. Everything else was just noise. Everything else was my career, Chen. Exactly. She smiled, sad and knowing. You chose people over career. That's not failure, sir. That's wisdom. The 72 hours stretched into 96 due to administrative delays. During that time, Mercer existed in a liminal space. Not quite an officer, not quite a civilian, not quite anything. He cleaned his quarters, organized files, wrote letters to soldiers from past deployments. Small tasks that felt like preparation for transition. On the 4th day, he was summoned back to the conference room. The board sat with expressions that revealed nothing. The colonel spoke without preamble. Captain Mercer, we've reviewed all testimony and evidence. Our finding is mixed and will likely dissatisfy everyone. He paused, organizing papers. We find that your tactical decision to surrender was within command discretion given the circumstances as you understood them. We do not recommend court-martial or criminal charges. Mercer felt something release in his chest. Not quite relief, not quite vindication. However, the colonel continued, we find that your mission planning and pre-engagement reconnaissance were inadequate. You proceeded into uncertain terrain with insufficient preparation. This represents a failure of professional judgment. Our recommendation is a formal letter of reprimand and reassignment to non-command duties. It was, Mercer recognized, the compromise verdict. Not innocent, not guilty, just flawed, human, preserved, but damaged. Do you understand this finding, Captain? Yes, sir. Do you wish to respond? Mercer thought about defending himself, about arguing that no amount of preparation could have prevented the ambush. But what was the point? The board needed to blame someone without destroying him. This was that balance. No, sir. I accept the finding. Very well. You'll be reassigned to battalion operations within 30 days. Dismissed. He left the room for the 2nd time, this time knowing exactly where he stood. Alive, employed, diminished. It could have been worse. It could have been better. It was what it was. Rourke found him an hour later. Heard the verdict. How do you feel? Like I lost something I didn't know I could lose. What's that? The certainty that I knew what right looked like. Rourke nodded slowly. Welcome to the other side, sir, where everything's gray and nothing's simple. How do you stand it? One day at a time, one decision at a time, and remembering that perfect is the enemy of good enough. The reassignment came through a week later. Mercer would serve as an operations planning officer, a desk position that kept him in the military but away from soldiers. It was the kind of job that preserved his paycheck while acknowledging his command days were over. He accepted without complaint. What else could he do? The machinery of military justice had rendered judgment. He could fight it, appeal it, rage against it, or he could accept that this chapter had ended and another was beginning whether he wanted it to or not. The day before his reassignment, his former company threw him an unofficial gathering. No fanfare, no speeches. Just soldiers and an officer sharing drinks in a cheap bar off base, pretending the occasion wasn't weighted with everything unsaid. Park approached, drunk enough to be honest. "Sir, I owe you an apology. I thought you were wrong. But my little brother, he's graduating high school next year, wants to enlist. And all I can think is I'm glad you're not his commander." "That's not much of an apology, Lieutenant." "No, sir. I mean, I'm glad because you'd keep him alive. You'd make the hard choices. And I'd want that for him. I'd want a commander who valued him more than medals." It was clumsy and sincere, and Mercer accepted it with a nod. Diaz said nothing, just shook his hand once firmly. Meta thanked him again. Kovich told him he'd written a recommendation letter for civilian employment if Mercer ever needed it. Chen was last. She hugged him, inappropriate by regulation, essential by circumstance. "You taught me something, sir, and I'm grateful, even if the lesson cost you everything." "What did I teach you?" "That courage isn't about dying well. It's about living with the consequences of keeping people alive." The gathering dissolved as midnight approached. Soldiers drifted away, returning to barracks and lives that would continue with or without him. Mercer walked back alone, feeling the weight of transition. His new position began the following Monday. It was exactly as advertised. Paperwork, logistics, planning exercises that would never face reality's test. He was competent at it, efficient even, but it lacked the weight of command, the sense that decisions mattered in ways that affected lives. Months passed. Winter arrived, then retreated. Mercer performed his duties with professional detachment, neither excelling nor failing. He became what the military needed him to be, a mid-level officer who filled a slot on an organizational chart. But something changed in how he understood himself. The shame of surrender, which had felt crushing initially, began to transform into something else. Not pride. He'd never feel proud of that day. But acceptance. Recognition that he'd faced an impossible choice and made one that aligned with his values, even when those values contradicted military tradition. He started sleeping better. The letter from his ex-wife stopped haunting him. He wrote her occasionally, not seeking reconciliation but maintaining connection. She responded with the warmth of someone who'd moved on but remembered fondly. They were becoming what they should have been years earlier, people who cared about each other without needing to own each other. A year after the incident, Mercer was approached by a young captain seeking advice. The captain had a troubled soldier, talented but erratic, personal issues bleeding into professional performance. "What should I do, sir? Regulations say document and discharge, but I think he's worth saving." Mercer looked at the young officer, saw his own younger self reflected. "What does your judgment say?" "That he needs help, not punishment." "Then help him. And if it costs you something professionally, accept that some costs are worth paying." "The battalion commander won't like that, sir." "Probably not, but you're not commanding for your battalion commander. You're commanding for your soldiers. Never forget which matters more." The captain left looking uncertain but determined. Mercer smiled, recognizing the expression. Leadership was uncertainty made mobile. You never knew if you were right. You just chose and accepted consequences. 2 years after the incident, Mercer was promoted to major. Not because of his command record, that remained a permanent asterisk, but because he'd proven competent in his staff role and the military needed mid-level officers. The promotion felt hollow, but he accepted it. Rank was just a designation. What mattered was what you did with authority when you had it. He requested and received assignment to a training unit, teaching young officers leadership principles. It was ironic in ways he appreciated, the officer who'd surrendered teaching others when to fight. But his lectures were popular because he taught from complexity, not doctrine. He taught that command was about impossible choices, not confident certainty. His students struggled with this initially, They wanted clear answers, definitive solutions. He gave them case studies with no correct responses, scenarios where every option was flawed. "Sir," one student complained, "how do we prepare if there's no right answer?" By accepting that preparation means being ready to choose, not finding perfect solutions. Leadership isn't about being right. It's about being responsible. 5 years after the incident, Mercer received an unexpected email from Kovich, now a civilian working in international development. The email was brief. "Sir, I've been thinking about that valley a lot lately. I work in conflict zones now, trying to help people rebuild. And I've learned something. Those soldiers who surrounded us, most of them are dead now. Different conflict, different valley, but same outcome. They chose fighting. We chose living. I understand now why you made that call. We get to keep building. They don't. Thank you for giving me that chance." Mercer read it 3 times, then filed it carefully. Vindication, when it came, was quiet. No dramatic moment. No public recognition. Just a slowly accumulating understanding that the choice, though costly, had been right. He attended Rourke's retirement ceremony that spring. The first sergeant had made it to 25 years, retirement with full benefits. His daughter, now a physical therapist, attended with her father's grandchildren. During the reception, Rourke pulled Mercer aside. "You know what I tell people when they ask about my service?" "What's that?" "I tell them I served under an officer who saved my life by surrendering. And when they look confused, I explain that courage means different things at different times. Sometimes it's fighting. Sometimes it's living with the judgment of people who don't understand." He paused. "You gave me this, sir. My grandkids, my retirement, my daughter's success. All of it traces back to that valley. You would have found another way, First Sergeant. Maybe, but I didn't have to. Because you made a choice that cost you everything and gave me everything. That's not weakness. That's strength most people will never understand." They stood together, 2 soldiers bound by a decision that would define them differently but permanently. 10 years after the incident, Mercer was a lieutenant colonel himself, assigned to doctrine development. He'd written papers on adaptive leadership, ethical command, and the psychology of impossible choices. His work was respected if not celebrated. Too nuanced for promotion material, too honest for comfortable reading. He never remarried, dated occasionally, but couldn't commit to relationships that required presence he wasn't sure he could provide. The military had taught him to hold things loosely, to accept that permanence was an illusion. Some lessons couldn't be unlearned, but he mentored younger officers with the intensity of someone paying forward wisdom earned through failure. He told them about the valley, about the surrender, about the cost of choosing lives over glory. Some understood, others didn't. That was fine. Understanding came through experience, not explanation. He received a package one autumn afternoon, no return address. Inside was a worn journal and a note from Chen. "Sir, I'm getting out. 20 years full retirement. I'm okay now, took a long time, but I'm okay. Found this journal from that deployment. Thought you should have it. There's an entry from the day before the valley. I wrote, 'Captain Mercer seems distant today, like he's already somewhere else.' I didn't understand then. I do now. You were preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. That's what leadership looks like. Thank you for modeling it." Mercer read Chen's journal entry from that day. She was right. He had been distant, feeling the weight of decisions not yet made but already anticipated. Leadership was often prescient grief, mourning outcomes before they materialized. 15 years after the incident, Mercer attended a military ethics conference where a young major presented a case study titled "The Judgment of Command, Surrender, and Leadership." It was about his valley, his choice, his career. The presenter argued that Mercer's decision represented pragmatic leadership over traditional valor. During the Q&A, someone asked, "But doesn't this undermine military discipline, if officers can simply surrender when combat becomes difficult?" Mercer stood from the audience. "May I respond?" The presenter recognized him, went pale. "Sir, I didn't know you were attending." "It's fine. I'll answer the question." He turned to the audience. "Leadership isn't about choosing easy or hard. It's about choosing what serves your responsibility. My responsibility was to 43 soldiers. Fighting served tradition. Surrendering served lives. I chose lives. If that undermines discipline, then discipline needed undermining." The room was silent. "But," Mercer continued, "every situation is different. What was right in my valley might be wrong in another. Leadership isn't about applying rules. It's about judgment informed by values. And sometimes judgment costs everything. But that's the burden we accept when we accept command. He sat down. The conference continued, but he'd said what needed saying. His choice was his, not a template for others. Leadership was personal, situational, impossible to standardize. 20 years after the incident, Mercer retired from the military at the rank of colonel, not because of the valley that had been absorbed into his record as a complicated footnote, but because 27 years was enough. He'd given what he could give. It was time for others to carry forward. His retirement ceremony was small, attended by soldiers from across his career. Park, now a major with his own command. Chen, long retired but present out of respect. Kovich, successful in civilian life. Rourke, elderly now but still carrying himself with military bearing. The presiding general gave the standard speech about service and sacrifice. Then he added unexpectedly, "Colonel Mercer's career is remarkable not for its perfection, but for its honesty. He made difficult choices and accepted consequences. He led with humanity when doctrine demanded otherwise. The military needs officers who can follow orders, but it also needs officers who understand that orders serve principles, not the reverse." Colonel Mercer exemplified that understanding. It was, Mercer recognized, redemption offered quietly, years too late to change anything but early enough to matter. After the ceremony, he stood alone for a moment, looking at the base where he'd spent so many years. So much had happened. So much had changed. The valley that had nearly destroyed him had instead refined him into something different than he'd planned to become. Less certain, more human. A young lieutenant approached hesitantly. "Sir, I'm being deployed next month. First command. I'm terrified." "Good. Terror means you understand what's at stake. How do you prepare for making impossible choices?" Mercer thought about that valley, that surrender, that cost. You don't. You accept that impossible choices are coming. You trust your values. And you remember that being responsible means accepting consequences, not avoiding them. That's terrifying, sir. Yes, but it's also honest. And honesty is the best preparation I can offer. The lieutenant thanked him and left. Mercer remained, watching the sun set over familiar terrain. Somewhere in a valley far away, the spot where he'd surrendered still existed. The rocks unchanged, the terrain indifferent. But the choice made there had rippled outward, touching lives, changing outcomes, becoming part of a larger story about what leadership means when abstraction meets reality. He'd lost his marriage, his command, his certainty. But he'd kept something more important, the lives of people who'd trusted him and the integrity to live with consequences of choosing them. That evening, alone in his civilian apartment for the first time in 27 years, Mercer wrote a letter to his younger self. He'd never send it, obviously, but writing it felt necessary. You're going to face a choice that will define everything. It will feel impossible. It will cost you nearly everything. But you'll make it anyway, because deep down, you'll know what matters. Trust that knowledge. Trust your responsibility to people over reputation. And when the cost comes due, and it will, accept it with dignity. Because some choices aren't about winning. They're about living with yourself afterward. Choose to be able to look in the mirror. Everything else is negotiable. He sealed the letter in an envelope marked, "The Captain I Was," and placed it in a drawer. Symbolic, meaningless, essential. The days that followed were strange. No réveillé, no formations, no responsibility for anyone but himself. Freedom felt like amputation. He'd defined himself by service so long that its absence created an identity void. But slowly he began filling that void. He volunteered at veteran support organizations, helping younger soldiers transition to civilian life. He taught part-time at a community college, leadership courses for business students who'd never face combat, but would face impossible choices of different kinds. He wrote a book, finally, not about tactics or strategy, but about the human cost of command. It was published by a small press, sold modestly, and reached the audience that needed it, young officers wrestling with the gap between what they'd been taught and what they'd experienced. 5 years into retirement, he received a letter from the Army War College. Would he be willing to serve as a guest lecturer on ethical leadership? He agreed and spent a week with senior officers discussing case studies that had no clean answers. One colonel, after a particularly difficult session, approached him privately. "Sir, I'm facing a decision similar to your valley. Different context, but same equation. And I'm terrified of making the wrong choice. What does your conscience say? That I need to prioritize people over mission, but my career will survive or won't. But you'll survive with integrity or without it. Choose which version of yourself you want to become. The colonel nodded slowly. How do you live with being right when everyone says you're wrong? Mercer smiled, tired and honest. You stop asking for permission to trust yourself. A decade into retirement, Mercer was 71 years old. He'd outlived some of his soldiers, attended funerals, written letters to families. The valley receded into history, becoming something younger officers studied rather than lived. But he still remembered every detail. The weight of the decision, the faces of his soldiers, the man who'd accepted his surrender with professional courtesy, the long walk back empty-handed and heavy-hearted. He'd learned that leadership wasn't about always being right. It was about being responsible. And responsibility meant carrying the weight of your choices, justified or not, celebrated or condemned forever. On the 20th anniversary of his retirement, Mercer visited Arlington National Cemetery. Not for anyone specific, just to walk among the markers, to remember what service meant at its simplest. People who'd chosen to serve something larger than themselves, then paid whatever cost that service demanded. He stopped at a marker for a soldier who'd died at 34, the same age Mercer had been in that valley. The marker read, duty, honor, country. Simple words for complicated commitments. Mercer stood there for a long time, thinking about duty that demanded death, honor that cost careers, countries that asked impossibly much of imperfect people. Finally, he spoke aloud, though no one was there to hear. I chose my duty differently than you chose yours. I lived when you died. Was I wrong? I don't know. But I chose and I lived with it. That's all any of us can do. The wind moved through the trees, indifferent to declarations. Mercer walked back to his car, moving more slowly than he once did. Age accumulated like consequences, quietly, inevitably, changing what seemed permanent. But he walked with something he hadn't possessed in that valley 27 years earlier. Acceptance. Not peace. Peace was for people who made easy choices. But acceptance that he'd faced complexity and responded with humanity. That his career had cost him, but his values had sustained him. That leadership meant bearing burdens, not avoiding them. In the end, that was the lesson he'd learned and tried to teach. Command wasn't about never failing. It was about failing honestly, accepting consequences completely, and trusting that integrity mattered more than victory. He drove home through traffic that cared nothing for military service, past people whose lives never intersected with valleys and impossible choices. And that was fine. Most people would never face what he'd faced. They'd face different trials, make different mistakes, carry different weights. But the principle remained universal. When faced with impossible choices, choose what lets you remain yourself. Choose what preserves what matters most. Choose knowing the cost will come and accept that cost as the price of living according to values rather than convenience. Mercer arrived home, made coffee, sat by a window watching evening arrive. He was old now, retired long enough that uniform felt like costume when he wore it to ceremonies. His military career was history. His valley was a case study. His soldiers were scattered, living lives he'd helped preserve. And he was content. Not happy in the simple sense, not unburdened, but content with the weight he'd carried, the choice he'd made, the cost he'd paid. Because in the end, leadership wasn't about success. It was about responsibility. And he'd been responsible. To his soldiers, to his values, to the version of himself he wanted to become. That night before sleep, he wrote one final addition to the letter to his younger self. You'll wonder if it was worth it. The cost will seem too high. But decades later, you'll realize that preserving lives and integrity was never too high a price. You'll realize that courage means different things at different times. And you'll realize that the valley didn't break you. It revealed you. Trust what it revealed. He placed the letter back in its drawer, turned off the light, and slept without dreams. The next morning began like any other. Coffee, news, small tasks. But Mercer moved through it with the quiet certainty of someone who'd faced the worst and survived not just physically, but spiritually. He'd been a soldier, a commander, a survivor, a teacher. He'd made an impossible choice that cost him nearly everything and saved what mattered most. He'd lived long enough to see that choice transform from shame to wisdom, from failure to lesson. And in living that transformation, he'd become something rare, a leader who'd chosen humanity over heroism, and discovered that humanity was the deeper heroism all along.